Hello, and welcome to Compromise Without Compromising, Centering Equity in the Interview Process. We are so excited that you've chosen to watch our session recording today, and we look forward to seeing you in the Q&A shortly. My name is Amanda Albert, and I am the Campus Library Manager at St. Louis Community College.
I'm Jamie Emery, and I'm the User Experience and Technology Outreach Coordinator at Washington University in St. Louis.
I'm Rebecca Hyde. I'm a Research and Instruction Librarian at St. Louis University.
And finally, I'm Sarah Fancher, Director of Content Classification at Elsevier.
We just wanted to take a moment to express some gratitude before starting. Thank you to Charleston for providing us with the opportunity to share our work. And thank you to all of you for showing up and for choosing our session. So let's get started. This presentation is born out of a recently published book chapter that encapsulates the theoretical underpinnings and practical applications of virtual interviews as an inclusive practice. Today, we will discuss why we believe virtual interviews are universally inclusive. We will describe theories that underlie our work. Then we will highlight strategies to help you form a practice of inclusive interviewing. During our Q&A session, we'll answer any questions that you might have about inclusive interviewing strategies, and hopefully we'll hear from you about what you've tried at your institutions. Next slide, please. So by the end of this session, you will recognize the benefits of virtual interviewing, identify the principles of inclusive interviewing informed by intersectional feminist ethics of care, and prioritize ways in which you can move your institution toward more inclusive interviewing. Next slide, please. As a group, the four of us have long lamented issues within academic hiring practices, particularly interviews. Many watching might be familiar with traditional interview processes. They might resemble something like an exhausting 2-day-long gauntlet of travel, endless meetings with a variety of stakeholders, a job talk, or for those of us with a background in reference and instruction, the dreaded teaching prompt, and sharing meals or making small talk with people that you've just met. I'm exhausted just thinking about it. Being on during the entire interview, while also having to deal with the physical and mental challenges, such as fatigue and brain fog from travel, or lack of sleep due to nerves, aches and pains from a chronic illness, social masking, finding time to pump and store breast milk if you're a working parent of a small child. All of this potentially leaves candidates physically, mentally, emotionally, and/or spiritually drained. Even for our extroverted friends, this can be daunting. However, we have found a lot of these negative effects of interviewing were ameliorated when we participated in virtual interviews, either on search committees or being the interviewee. We realized there were things about the virtual interview process that felt inherently candidate-centered and more inclusive. In this presentation, we challenge the hazing mindset that some of us or our colleagues or our institutions still have around interviewing. We assert that when candidates feel a process centers them, they and the search committee can bring their whole self to the interview, which makes for a more inclusive and authentic interview. And it offers the institution or the library an opportunity to shift culture. We understand that challenging and changing what we accept as typical interviewing practices can be difficult, especially when we are bound by the constraints of parent institutions. But we are not totally powerless. And that is what we hope you walk away with today, a sense of your own power armed with strategies to influence change, no matter how small that change may be. You can make compromises and work within your current system while not compromising on an inclusive experience. Next slide. Traditional interviews that we have been a part of have had some inclusive elements, but inclusion was not built into the process. And some of the things that we considered typical, either institutionally or societally within the interview process, could have been and probably were harmful to candidates. Then the COVID-19 pandemic changed the way many of us were interviewing, including the way that we were hiring, changed the way that many of us were working, including the way that we were hiring and interviewing. As many of us went virtual at work, so did our interviews. COVID, as a life-changing mass casualty and mass disabling event, woke us up to the ways that we and our institutions, through what was considered a standard interview practice, were perpetuating cultures of white supremacy, ableism, and patriarchy. Not that we weren't aware before, but this really spotlighted the interview process for us. Through our research, we found virtual interviewing to be a routine practice in many other fields. It is one of those things that are happening outside of the library profession that we could potentially look to adapt and align with our values. For example, virtual interviews tend to reduce financial and time burdens, reduce anxiety, and offer flexibility to candidates. Candidates who are Black and Indigenous people of color, neurodivergent, disabled, or LGBTQ have been shown to greatly benefit from these interviewing changes as well. So armed with research and experience, we embrace virtual interviews in order to design a more universally inclusive experience. We found these practices aligned with our own philosophical leanings, including feminist ethics of care and caring for the whole person. Sarah is going to talk to us a little bit more about those underlying theories.
Thank you. Our thinking has roots in feminist ethics of care, which was first conceptualized by second-wave feminist theorists in the 1980s as a framework of moral philosophy based on care for others within the context of relationships. So it's inherently person-centered. Though caring for and nurturing others is too often regarded as reproductive rather than productive labor, and therefore tends to be undervalued in a capitalist system, we view care for others as a fiduciary duty that we owe to one another as colleagues or potential colleagues, as workers, as humans. And that's a duty owed regardless of individual identity, just based on our shared humanity. We assert that organizations have a duty and obligation to support the well-being of candidates as well as current employees. We propose a shift in organizational culture toward caring about whole people as a matter of policy. Deliberately embracing an ethic of care in an inclusive interviewing process is, of course, not a panacea for all the ills of patriarchal capitalism, but it is one small step in the right direction. Next slide, please. Among other things, caring for the whole person means creating safe, authentic, and inclusive environments for the candidate so they can begin to imagine themselves as truly belonging, both in the role and in the workplace. Part of our collective responsibility is to address how predominantly white institutions, such as those of higher education, tend to automatically reinforce white supremacy, ableism, and racism. Approaching interviewing with an ethic of care can help to mitigate some of those harms. Do our default choices create pressure for candidates to expose themselves to potential illness or to unnecessary discomfort? One obvious example of this is the varying individual comfort levels with things like travel and indoor dining in the context of early COVID, but expectations around breaks and rest and meals to eat are other ways of caring for the body as well. And remember that interviewing is an inherently embodied practice. Search committees are actively recruiting a whole person with a body, not just the intellectual capacities of a person to fill an open role. So care for the body is important, and we'll talk about some more specific strategies shortly. Next slide, please. And then finally, as Amanda alluded to, traditional interview processes often entail a full 1 or 2 day gauntlet of meetings, job talks, meals, campus tours, etc., which can skew very white, middle class, able-bodied, and extroverted. I, for one, am an extrovert, and I love the opportunity to gain energy from talking to new people and imagining myself in a new setting. You can have the fantasy of a whole new life. But even I acknowledge that these defaults set candidates up to either perform or to hide their authentic selves. It's really hard to be fully authentic under such high stakes, high pressure circumstances. And candidates with visible or invisible disabilities face additional hurdles during this sort of traditional academic library interview process, particularly with the unstructured social elements. It's been described as social performance by Arch and Gilman. These parts of the interview, along with the marathon nature of multi-day in-person academic interviews generally, can be physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausting and not actually indicative of future job performance. Instead, they reward social skills, conformity, and normativity, further contributing to the homogenous nature of our field. Instead of requiring candidates to request accommodations or perhaps struggle to do their best to adjust to interview norms, we could move toward a more generous process that centers inclusivity and care for each person from the outset and assesses their abilities to do the job, not to perform likability in an interview setting. And now we'll hear more about some strategies, some tactics for putting this into practice at your local institution.
Thanks, Sarah. Completely revamping the interview process, even if you don't move to virtual, may not be possible all at once, whether due to internal resistance or due to the workload of those organizing the interview process. And honestly, there will always be things you can change to make your process even more inclusive. We think that any steps towards more inclusive interviews should be celebrated, even if you can't make all the changes you would like or can't make them all at once. We want to share strategies and ideas that we have either tried or seen in our research for making the interview process more inclusive. While some of these strategies cover the hiring process in general, our focus is really on the final interview stage and on designing an interview that is a positive experience for as many people as possible. We're dividing our strategies into 8 sometimes overlapping categories, some concrete and some a bit more philosophical. These first 2 categories are really the ones we need to be extra thoughtful about for virtual interviews. So an accepting responsibility for costs is widely accepted as a best practice for in-person interviews, even if it's not always implemented perfectly. But it's important to remember that virtual interviews are not free. And if we're not careful, the burden of costs may be significantly shifted onto candidates. If you are holding a virtual interview for which candidates need more than a phone, consider giving candidates a list of technical requirements well ahead of time, with the offer to provide everything needed, including equipment, service, and software. This might be through laptop rentals or by purchasing and sending smaller items such as headphones. Also consider the potential cost of things like space and food that the library would provide for an in-person interview. Offering to provide all candidates a hotel room with high-speed internet access allows them to simply accept the offer or turn it down, rather than struggling with the decision to disclose or not personal circumstances that may make a virtual interview in their home very difficult. Since you won't be taking candidates out for any meals, consider sending a food delivery gift card redeemable in the candidate's local area, allowing them to focus on the interview. This might all sound expensive, but it is unlikely to be any more expensive than flying a candidate out for an interview, and in most cases, much less expensive. Candidates will likely only accept these offers if they are actually needed, but they know better than you if they are needed. They shouldn't need to justify accepting any of these offers. And whatever format you end up using for your interviews, as much as possible, pay for things up front so that candidates don't need to use their own money, which they may or may not have, and then wait for reimbursement. For in-person interviews, consider simply providing candidates with an upfront per diem for food and incidentals. For some of these costs, you may be constrained by institutional policies regarding how money can be spent, but even asking can help change thinking at the institutional level. For the technical skills and support, virtual interviews in particular require more use and comfort with technology. It's important not to assume your candidate knows how to use all the software and technology they'll need to use for those virtual interviews. Provide candidates with a guide to the software you'll be using in the interview. Provide them a chance to practice. Provide technical support during the interview in case there are issues on their end or yours. Consider building in extra time at the start of the interview or in each interview session for troubleshooting. And practice empathy. Lack of opportunity or experience doesn't equal an inability to learn, and unexpected technical issues happen to all of us. Even if in-person interviews are standard at your workplace, most of us now use virtual meeting software for screening interviews, and these same considerations apply. Especially for screening interviews, consider if you really need to have a videos on virtual interview, or if you can default to no cameras and allow candidates to simply call in if they prefer. Consistent, empathetic communication throughout the hiring process is essential. Don't assume candidates are knowledgeable about the academic hiring process or what that process looks like at your institution. Holding a Zoom information session during the recruitment period allows the committee to talk to many candidates at once and really explain the local process as well as what the committee is looking for. It's also a way to market your library, institution, and city to potential candidates. This is also a good time to share the planned timeline for the search. At many institutions, the hiring process can seem ridiculously long, and making it clear ahead of time, with the caveat that things might change, will help candidates know what to expect. Once you move into the interview phase, communication with selected candidates should be regular and ongoing. Having more information can help mitigate the anxiety and uncertainty that comes with the interview process, even for experienced candidates. Make sure you are also communicating internally and ensure all interviewers understand what is expected of them in the process, including which questions are illegal. That may seem basic, but it's better to assume that everyone needs a reminder. How to communicate with candidates, whether by phone or email, is often left up to the search committee, chair, or hiring manager, and we all have different preferences. For candidates you invite for screening or final interviews, consider asking them ahead of time how they would like to receive good or bad news. Being rejected is so hard. The most empathetic way to deliver that news is in the way the candidate prefers, not the way you prefer. Thinking about the interview schedule, strategies for creating a more inclusive schedule really start with communication. We believe the candidate should be a partner in creating the schedule, not simply a recipient. Ask candidates lots of questions about their preferences. Is there a time of day they cannot start before and after which they cannot continue? Do they prefer frequent short breaks or longer breaks more infrequently? What time zone will they be in on the day of the interview? If the interview is in person, there should also be questions about dietary and drink preferences, if they prefer to eat alone or in a group, if they have a preference for outdoors or indoor dining, if they are interested in a tour of the campus, do they prefer to walk or have a driving golf cart tour, etc. While it may seem overwhelming to ask candidates so many questions, giving as many options as possible means they are less likely to need to request accommodations or to feel like the burden needs to be high enough to make such a request. This gives candidates more agency and ever so slightly shifts the balance of power away from the interviewers. Even before communicating with candidates about scheduling interviews, make it a standard practice in your organization to check the calendar for religious and cultural holidays and avoid them, or at least offer options that fall on different days. If a holiday cannot be avoided, for example, if all of your interviews will fall within the month of Ramadan, consider how you can make the process more humane for those who celebrate. Do your research so you can offer these same options for at least all major religions, and don't hesitate to ask candidates if you have missed something that will impact the schedule for them. Offering many options can lead to different interview schedules, but the goal is not equality or conformity, but to provide equity in the process and create an environment where each candidate is able to do their best. For virtual interviews, also consider the effects of Zoom fatigue on your candidates. Normalize and encourage cameras off until it is time to start a session, and consider sitting slightly farther back from your camera so the effect is more like sitting across the table from someone rather than being up in their personal space.
For interview questions, ask all candidates the same prepared questions and provide them to candidates a week or more in advance. This practice can lessen candidate anxiety, reduce structural bias, and provide a more equitable process, particularly for neurodiverse candidates. It's important to remember that most academic library positions don't require making big decisions under pressure. When candidates have time to consider questions, we get more thoughtful answers, a more conversational interview, and arguably a better indicator of how they might perform in the position. In addition to your prepared questions, consider writing potential follow-up questions in case additional information is needed. These don't need to be identical for each candidate, but having them prepared will help reduce potential bias and keep questions from straying too far into the personal, while still providing the information you need to make a decision. Identity. Well before the interviews, think about ways you can demonstrate how candidates' intersecting identities will be at home in your library. This might include providing candidates with library DEIA statements that include accessibility information about the library, information about the demographic makeup of the employees, and how DEIA is centered in library policies, procedures, and work culture. Creating such a statement may be out of your control, but you can still provide candidates with information about campus DEIA initiatives, employee affinity groups, etc. Sharing videos of physical spaces and current employees describing their work, what they like about the organization, and answering common questions can give candidates an idea of how their intersecting identities will be at home in your library. Particularly for virtual interviews, this will provide them with information that may otherwise be more difficult to glean. There are also more personal ways we can show candidates we respect their identities. Prior to the interview, offer candidates an opportunity to send pronouns, the name they would like used, and an audio recording of how to pronounce their name. A service like Name Coach is an easy way to offer this, especially since anyone can create a name badge with them for free, which includes pronouns and audio name pronunciation. Consider providing the same information along with position and contact information for everyone the candidates will be meeting during their interview. Ensure that candidates have time during their interview for informal meetings where they can ask questions without influencing decision-making. Ideally, these sessions should be offered solely for the candidate's benefit and separate from evaluative parts of the interview. Next slide, please. In our research, we found that the most commonly reported disadvantage of virtual interviews is an inability to gain a good understanding of the physical workplace environment, the culture, and the city an institution is located in. If you are holding virtual interviews for a position that will be in-person or hybrid, we recommend that you offer your final candidate an optional, all expenses paid visit to campus following a former offer with salary. An on-campus visit allows candidates to see spaces in which they might work, the people with whom they might work, and get a better idea of how the organization lives its stated values. This visit may impact the candidate's assessment of whether or not the institution is aligned with their personal values and goals, so the visit should not be contingent upon them accepting the position. One possible institutional concern is that a candidate may accept this trip offer with no intention of taking the position. Those with this concern should reflect on the patriarchal thinking that if the library spends money on a candidate, the library is owed something in return. Finding the right candidate, one who is right for the institution and for whom the institution is right, is an investment of time and money that will pay off in the long run. Trust that candidates have no wish to waste their own time or yours, and that an in-person visit may reveal things about the institution or place that make them no longer interested. Whether candidates are successful or not, they are our professional colleagues and deserve the same flexibility and grace we provide to everyone in our lives. This is not so much a strategy as a way of being throughout the whole interview process. Search committee chairs or hiring managers are in a position to infuse a feminist ethic of care into the interview process and remind everyone involved to recognize and set aside biases and any capitalist expectations that the organization comes before the individual. They can frame and influence the ways in which colleagues receive news about rescheduling needs, technical difficulties, and even candidate requests that differ from those considered standard interview processes. Advising everyone involved in the interview that they should not take any of these issues or requests into consideration when evaluating the candidate, and emphasizing the need for understanding and flexibility can be impactful and even sow seeds of change in the organization. In conclusion, it's important to acknowledge that it will take time and persistence to build empathy into academic library recruitment practices and make them more person-centered. One might not be able to implement every desired change, but gradual progress in this direction must be prioritized and celebrated. Prioritizing inclusive and accessible interviewing means rejecting capitalist notions of profit above all else, and instead creating an environment in which people are valued more. We know it can be difficult for those of us in academic libraries to imagine alternatives to processes that have served us and our organizations well in the past. However, these processes haven't served everyone equally. Some may argue that because they endured a grueling in-person multi-day interview process, that those who come after them should too. We need to reject this kind of hazing mindset and provide our future colleagues better experiences than our own. And we can do that by embedding feminist principles of empathy and care into all of our practices. Next slide, please. Here is our list of sources. And as Amanda mentioned, we wrote a book chapter on this topic. You can find in the new book, Person-Centered Management in Academic Libraries. We hope you'll check it out. All right, now we look forward to talking with you in our live Q&A session.